Why did God really destroy the Canaanites? Was it simply about land, Israel needing territory to settle in? Or was there something more sinister, something ancient, hidden, and so dangerous that God Himself declared they must not remain? You see, when most people hear about the Canaanites, they think of a distant tribe in the Old Testament, swept away by Israel's armies. But the story is far stranger and far darker than that. These weren't just people living on a patch of land. They were a culture, a system, a civilization with practices so disturbing that Scripture itself describes the land as vomiting them out. Think about that. The land couldn't even hold them anymore. But why? What did they do? What was so serious, so offensive, so spiritually poisonous that God, who is described as merciful and slow to anger, commanded not just their defeat, but their total destruction? This isn't a story of simple war. This is a story of a divine judgment that still unsettles readers today. A story that makes us wrestle with the very nature of God, His justice, His holiness, and His wrath. And here's the real mystery. Beneath the surface of this judgment lies a secret that most people never hear in Sunday school, a truth rarely spoken from pulpits, a truth that might just change the way you see the Old Testament forever. But before we uncover it, let me invite you. If you love diving deep into the hidden corners of the Bible, into the mysteries most skip over, then hit that like button, subscribe to the Bible and Reflection, and tap the bell icon so you never miss another journey into the stories the world has forgotten. Now, let's step into the shadows of Canaan and ask the question no one dares to answer. Why did God really destroy them? To understand why God destroyed the Canaanites, we first need to ask a more basic question. Who were they? The name Canaanites doesn't describe a single tribe. It's more like an umbrella term for many nations who lived in the land of Canaan, what we would call the Promised Land. Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, and more. Together, they formed a patchwork of kingdoms and city-states that stretched across fertile valleys, fortified hills, and coastal trade routes. On the outside, they seemed powerful. Their cities were strong, their culture rich. Ancient sources tell us they were skilled traders, craftsmen, and builders. They were not a people without brilliance. Their societies were advanced for their time. And yet, beneath the glittering surface of prosperity lay something rotten, something toxic. The Canaanites were infamous in the ancient world for their religion. Their gods were not gods of love or justice or mercy. They were gods of violence, lust, and cruelty. The chief deities, Baal and Asherah, demanded rituals that would shock even hardened hearts. In the quiet of sacred groves, carved with wooden poles, worshippers engaged in rituals so debased that they blurred the line between religion and corruption. Sexual immorality wasn't just tolerated, it was woven into their worship. The very act of approaching the divine was an invitation to indulge the darkest human desires. And then there were the sacrifices. Not sacrifices of grain, Not even sacrifices of animals, but children. The Canaanites were notorious for offering their sons and daughters to the flames of Molech, a deity whose worship demanded the unthinkable. Imagine the cries of infants placed on burning altars, their lives consumed in smoke, while drums beat louder to drown out the sound. The Bible doesn't exaggerate this horror. Archaeology has uncovered sites where charred remains of infants were buried in jars, mute witnesses to rituals so cruel they leave us shuddering even today. This was not merely a culture with a few bad habits. It was a culture built upon corruption, a civilization sustained by violence, perversion, and death. And here's where the mystery deepens. The Bible describes the land of Canaan as being so defiled by its people that it was, in a sense, polluted. Leviticus says the land itself vomited out its inhabitants. That's strange language, isn't it? The land vomiting? It suggests that the very soil could no longer sustain their wickedness. It was as if creation itself rejected them. But why was their corruption so unique? Were they really worse than other ancient peoples who also worshipped idols and fought wars? Or is there something more going on here? Something hidden? When Israel stood on the borders of the Promised Land, God didn't tell them to simply move in peacefully. He told them to drive out the Canaanites completely, not partly, completely. It wasn't just about land. It was about removing something that could not coexist with his people. The Canaanites were not simply enemies. They represented a threat, a spiritual infection, a darkness that, if left alive, would spread like fire through dry grass. And history proves it. Whenever Israel compromised with the Canaanites, whenever they adopted their customs, the result was always the same: corruption, idolatry, downfall. So the question becomes, what made them so dangerous? Why was their presence considered intolerable to the point that God Himself commanded their destruction? To find the answer, we need to go deeper, beyond history, beyond archaeology, into the very heart of the mystery. Because what lies beneath the Canaanites' destruction may not just be about them, but about something far older, something that traces back to ancient rebellions, fallen powers, and battles not just fought with swords, but with spirits.
On the surface, the Canaanites' destruction might look like a clash of nations. One people invading another, the stronger overcoming the weaker. That's how history usually works. But the Bible paints this as something much more unusual, something spiritual. When God spoke to Abraham centuries before Joshua marched around Jericho, He told him something strange. In Genesis 15, God promised Abraham the land of Canaan, but He said Abraham's descendants would not inherit it immediately. Why? Because God said the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. That's an odd phrase, isn't it? It's as if God was saying, their wickedness isn't finished yet. It's still growing, still ripening, and when it's full, then judgment will come. Think about that. God was patient for hundreds of years. The destruction of the Canaanites wasn't impulsive. It was the culmination of centuries of rebellion. It was judgment delayed until there was no room left for mercy. But what was this full measure of sin? Here, the shadows deepen. Ancient Jewish writings and even hints in the Bible suggest that the Canaanites weren't just ordinary idol worshippers. Their practices were connected to something darker, echoes of the days before the flood. Genesis 6 tells us a chilling story. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives, and the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. This strange passage has puzzled scholars for millennia, but many traditions believe it refers to fallen angels who corrupted humanity, producing a line of giants, a mingling of the divine and the human that God never intended. When the flood came, that corruption was wiped out. But was it gone forever? Or did its shadows linger? Numbers 13 gives us a haunting clue. When Israel's spies scouted the land of Canaan, they returned terrified. "We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Nephilim, in the land of Canaan, the very place God later commanded Israel to cleanse. What does that mean? Were the Canaanites themselves descendants of these ancient beings? Were their cities infused with a spiritual corruption that went beyond human depravity? Or were their practices designed to welcome those same rebellious powers back into the world? The Bible doesn't spell it out fully, but the pieces form a chilling picture. The Canaanites weren't simply idol worshippers. They were guardians of a system that preserved the very evils God had already judged once in the flood. Child sacrifice, sexual perversion tied to fertility rites, and perhaps even bloodlines tainted by forbidden unions. To allow them to remain would not just endanger Israel politically, it would threaten to undo God's plan of redemption itself. Israel was chosen to bring forth the Messiah, the one who would crush evil forever. But if Israel absorbed the Canaanite infection, if their worship was seduced by Baal and Molech, the line of promise could be destroyed. That's why the command was so absolute. Not because God delights in destruction, but because His plan to save the world hung in the balance. And here lies the mystery. The destruction of the Canaanites wasn't just an act of wrath, it was an act of preservation, a way of cutting out a cancer before it consumed the body. But let's pause here, because this raises an uncomfortable question. If God is just and merciful, how do we reconcile that with the command to destroy entire nations, men, women, even children? It's a question that has haunted scholars for centuries, a question that feels too dark, too unsettling to ask out loud. And yet, it is in that very question that we may discover the final piece of the puzzle. Because maybe the real reason God destroyed the Canaanites isn't simply about what they did, but about what he was protecting, about what would have happened if he didn't.
This is where the story grows uncomfortable. For many, the command to destroy the Canaanites feels too severe, too absolute, too final. How do we reconcile the God of mercy with the God of judgment? At first glance, it seems impossible. We prefer the God who forgives, the God who embraces the prodigal son, the God who so loved the world. But here, in the story of the Canaanites, we face the God who burns away corruption like fire consumes dry grass. And that is no contradiction. It is the same God, seen from another angle. Let's step carefully into this mystery. For centuries, God allowed the Canaanites to exist. He didn't wipe them away in Abraham's day. He gave them time. He gave them space. He gave them opportunities to repent. In fact, when Israel marched into Canaan, not every Canaanite was destroyed. Rahab in Jericho believed and was saved. The Gibeonites sought mercy and were spared. This tells us something critical. Destruction was not inevitable for individuals. Mercy was possible if they turned. But the culture as a whole, the system, the spiritual stronghold, was too far gone. Imagine a disease so aggressive it devours every organ it touches. What doctor seeing this would leave it unchecked? No, he would cut it out, no matter how painful the surgery. Judgment, in this sense, was divine surgery. Israel was God's scalpel, removing a spiritual cancer from the land. But still, why so harsh? Why entire cities? Why even children? This is the part that makes us tremble. And maybe it should. Because God's holiness is not partial. Sin is not harmless. Corruption left unchecked spreads. Even the youngest would grow up within a culture saturated with evil practices, destined to repeat them. What seems cruel in the short term was, in the long term, an act of stopping generations of destruction. And yet, there is more. Some scholars suggest that the Canaanites, by aligning themselves with idols, were not simply practicing religion, they were aligning with spiritual powers opposed to God, fallen beings who had corrupted humanity since Eden. Their rituals, their sacrifices, their immorality, it wasn't just human sin, it was partnership with rebellion itself. If that is true, then what happened in Canaan was not merely war. It was a confrontation between heaven and the powers of darkness, between God's plan to redeem the world and the forces determined to derail it. And in that battle, mercy takes a different shape. Mercy for Israel, who would inherit a land free of corruption. Mercy for the world, because through Israel would come the Messiah who would bring salvation. And yes, even mercy for the future, because God would not allow evil to multiply unchecked forever. But notice this, the destruction of the Canaanites, though absolute, was temporary. Their cities fell, their idols crumbled, their power was broken. But the story doesn't end there. The God who destroyed the Canaanites would later stretch out his arms, not in wrath, but in sacrifice. The same God who demanded holiness in the land would one day hang on a cross, offering forgiveness not just for Israel, but for every nation, including those who were once his enemies. Here lies the paradox. The God who destroys is also the God who saves. The God who judges sin is the same God who takes sin upon himself. And the destruction of the Canaanites, as terrifying as it is, points to a deeper truth. Sin must be dealt with, either in judgment or in grace. That is the truth no one tells you. The Canaanites were destroyed
not because God is cruel, but because God is holy, and because his plan to rescue the world could not be compromised. And when we wrestle with this story, when we feel the weight of it, we are reminded of something haunting, yet beautiful. If God takes sin this seriously, how much more should we cling to the mercy he offers? Because judgment is real, but so is grace. And the cross stands as proof that even when destruction falls, salvation is never far behind. The story of the Canaanites is not easy to face. It's one of those parts of the Bible that makes us pause, that stirs questions we may never fully answer on this side of eternity. But here's what we know. God is not reckless. He is not cruel. His judgments are never without reason. Behind the destruction of the Canaanites lies a truth the world rarely acknowledges. Sin is never small. Evil never stays contained. And sometimes mercy looks like judgment when judgment is the only way to stop destruction from spreading. The Canaanites remind us of the seriousness of sin, but they also remind us of something else: God's relentless commitment to preserve his plan of salvation. Through Israel came Christ, and through Christ came the offer of forgiveness, not just for Israel, but for every nation, even for us. So when we look at this story, we should not only tremble at God's holiness, we should also marvel at his mercy. The same God who destroyed the Canaanites stretched out his arms on the cross to rescue humanity from a far greater judgment. That is the mystery of this story. A God who judges, a God who saves, a God who leaves no evil unpunished, yet offers redemption to all who turn to him. And now I leave you with this question. If God took sin so seriously in Canaan, how seriously do we take it in our own lives today? Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the Bible's darkest, most mysterious stories. If this video stirred your heart, if it made you think deeper about the God of the Bible, then don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Bible and Reflection, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of this story shocked you the most? And how do you reconcile God's justice with his mercy? I'd love to hear your reflections. Until next time, remember, the Bible holds more mysteries than we often realize. And together, we will keep uncovering